If I were going to sing another song now.
It's just hard to explain. If you're not an Elvis fan, no explanation will suffice. If you are an Elvis fan, no explanation is necessary.
Elvis Presley was the king of pop, the king of rock and roll, the king of music. He is, I don't say was because his legend lives on, so his legend, Elvis Presley, is an American icon. He created popular music, rock and roll, the way we know it today. Elvis Presley precipitated a cultural revolution in America.
Teenagers twisting and riding and all that kind of stuff, and of course Elvis Presley being photographed from the waist up. Well, everyone knew what he was doing from the waist down, you know, sex.
So that star, quote-unquote, quality that he has, it has permeated the world. And it's that type of thing that you really can't explain, but even if you could, I don't think that you really would want to.
There can be no question whatsoever that Elvis Presley was one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century. In the history of music, he was perhaps the most influential performer the world has ever known. To this day, his impact as a singer and performer is absolutely monumental. And he's still enormously beloved by millions and millions of people the world over. His talent, good looks, sensuality, charisma, and good humor endeared him to his fans, as did the humility and human kindness he demonstrated throughout his life. To his fans, Elvis Presley will always be remembered as the king of rock and roll because he forever changed American music and culture. He is easily the most impersonated celebrity of all time. His home, Graceland, is the second most recognized residence in the nation besides the White House. His meteoric career is even more remarkable when you consider his meager beginnings. Yet the torments and joys of his upbringing helped make Elvis into the innovative entertainer he became. The lingering question of Elvis's life, however, and one that will forever haunt Elvis fans, is this: what might have been? Elvis died at 42 years of age. He had made a tremendous comeback in the latter years of his life. Despite the personal problems that plagued him, his live performances were often spectacular. He was making quality records once again, and in many ways was going back to the rock and roll roots that made him an icon to begin with. But then, within a few short years, Elvis declined quickly, and it was all over. Still, Elvis Presley will always remain a fixture in American popular culture because of his genius as a performer and recording artist. And yet, in examining his life and career, that one haunting question comes up time and time again: what might have been? Elvis Aaron Presley was born January 8, 1935 in East Tupelo, Mississippi, at the height of the Great Depression. Elvis was both blessed and burdened from birth. He was blessed with two poor but loving church-going parents, Vernon and Gladys Presley. Both were high school dropouts who endured very hard and poverty-stricken childhoods. Early in their marriage, Gladys was absolutely thrilled when Vernon built them a modest two-bedroom house which had amenities such as a wood stove and its own outhouse. Even in a small dirt road place like Tupelo, Mississippi, the Presleys were from the poor side of town.
The conditions that Elvis Presley grew up with in the 1930s was a time of Jim Crow segregation, and a time that most people, like his parents, lived in a sharecropper situation in which you had to have respect for authority but also had a quiet disdain for them. And Elvis Presley grew up with terrible hardships in which having your own outhouse was considered a great luxury. He looked for something of hope, and that hope was music.
Much more than the abject poverty of his childhood, Elvis Presley was burdened by survivor's guilt concerning the stillborn death of his twin brother, Jesse. His mother suffered medical complications during the birth that left her unable to have any more children. Gladys became extremely overprotective of her surviving child.
Elvis's mother felt that this was an omen, that this son that survived was destined for greatness. And so she was a very protective mother, and that kind of nurtured a very, very close relationship between the two of them. He adored his mother.
Vernon Presley was a sharecropper, laborer, and truck driver. He spent a year in jail for check fraud when Elvis was very young, but Vernon was not a criminal by any stretch of the imagination. He needed money for his family and changed a $4 check into a $40 check. It was a mistake he always regretted. Elvis Presley was always enthralled with music from a very young age. It was one of the few bright spots in his youth. He was exposed to gospel music at the First Assembly of God Church, where the impassioned swaying of the preacher and the congregation inspired him. Despite his natural shyness, Elvis sang publicly for the first time at the age of 10 at a county fair. Elvis would often go to the weekly music shows in the town square sponsored by a local radio station. There he was exposed to a wide variety of Southern music, including country singers, fiddlers, and guitar pickers. Unlike many whites at this time, he was also exposed to the music of the black farm hands who worked in the fields of Tupelo, Mississippi. These men sang to make their torturous field work as bearable as possible. He understood the gut-pulling sadness in their music that would eventually become rhythm and blues.
Growing up, he was pretty much a mama's boy, and he attended church, and he had a couple of friends that would take him over to the black part of Tupelo called Shake Rag, and he would listen to the Negro men playing their guitars on their porches. And he grew up liking the blues and gospel music. As a matter of fact, gospel music was Elvis's favorite music.
Artists are different. They have more in the way of adventurousness and nerve and a willingness to traverse certain of the taboos. In the case of someone like Elvis Presley, like other artists, he was particularly adventurous. When he sought out those artists, he knew where to go. They were practically his neighbors. You know, these are people he grew up with.
In time, music would begin to fill Elvis's need for positive attention and approval. He had an overwhelming desire to improve his family's economic standing. Despite being poorer than most white families in Tupelo, Vernon and Gladys were very strict in Elvis's upbringing. Elvis learned to have great respect for people in authority. It was a trait that would stay with him until the day he died. In 1948, with all their belongings packed in a broken-down jalopy, Vernon moved the family north to post-war Memphis to find better employment opportunities. Vernon found work at a paint factory, and Gladys became a nurse's assistant. The family moved into a low-income apartment complex. Fate, however, had placed Elvis Presley in the right place at the right time. Elvis sought out the local black musicians. As he got older, he often frequented Memphis's Beale Street clubs that were the home of the rhythm and blues singers who had come north from the Mississippi Delta. Elvis followed numerous types of emerging music and sang at every opportunity. Music was his hope for a better future.
Elvis's main musical influences were country and western, of course, and gospel music. He went to church with his mother and his father on Sundays and loved to sing in the choir, and also rhythm and blues.
At school, he was an uninspired student. In high school, Elvis was often ridiculed for the clothes he wore, his slick-back hair, and the fact that he often carried his guitar around in school. Indeed, Elvis was a rebel in the way he presented himself, but not in personality. He was a polite, respectful boy. He was just a quiet kid who had few friends but garnered attention by playing football and singing at school shows. Yet he did accomplish something his parents never did. He got a high school diploma. After graduating high school in 1953, Elvis found work as a truck driver with a salary of $37 a week. One day on his lunch break, Elvis stopped off at the Memphis Recording Service studio to record a song as a present for his mother's birthday. Sam Phillips, who owned the studio, also owned the small Sun record label.
1953, Elvis went into the Memphis recording studio, but Sam was not in the studio that day. But Marion Teesker set it all up for him. He was jamming with some friends of his, Scotty Moore and Phil Black. He met them before he went back to some studios, and then Scotty called Sam up and said, "You should listen to this guy."
In Elvis, Phillips saw the potential of a white performer whose singing style sounded like the black rhythm and blues singers who were denied access to white audiences. About a year later, Phillips felt the timing was right and contacted Elvis to record a song. Excited as Elvis was at the opportunity to sing professionally, even he could not have imagined in his wildest dreams the historic significance of this event. The recording session didn't begin well. Elvis didn't seem to connect vocally with the songs Phillips had selected. Elvis may have thought his singing career wouldn't survive his first recording session.
He was jamming in the studio all day trying to come up with a song, and then they came up with "That's All Right, Mama." And from there on, it's all history.
That recording is considered the true birth of rock and roll. The timing of Elvis's first recording session had its ironies as well. This recording session came just weeks after the Supreme Court's school desegregation order. Through his music, Elvis Presley was about to lay the roots of both a civil rights and youth culture revolution. Indeed, there was no question that Elvis opened the door for black musicians and entertainers to gain full acceptance into America's mainstream culture.
When Elvis walked out of that Sun record studio on July 5th, 1954, he was not prepared for the road he was about to travel as a musical icon. And despite having a good family, the pressures of being famous that almost nobody would be able to handle, he was especially not prepared for.
Little by little, Elvis developed his unique style. At his first live public appearance as a professional singer, Elvis's extreme nervousness made his entire body shake. To counteract this, he rose up on the balls of his feet to steady himself. His legs were still vibrating, but he noticed he calmed himself down by moving in rhythm to the music. His initial stage fright also caused him to involuntarily twist his lips into a sneer. When Elvis noticed the increasing excitement of the mostly female audience each time he would shake and sneer, his movements became more deliberate. The jiggling movement of his legs quickly became part of his performing style. "That's All Right, Mama" became a big seller in the Memphis area and garnered much radio play. Sam Phillips rushed Elvis back into the studio to record another record. With all the musical influences of his youth coming into play, Elvis forged his innovative stage and singing style. It was all rooted in rhythm and blues, country music, and gospel music. Brooding with an innocent sexual energy, he would develop an intimate rapport with his fans. Young working-class audiences connected with him because he was one of them. In 1955, Elvis went on the road, performing throughout the South and in Texas. At one Lone Star State performance, Elvis caught the attention of a talent scout who worked for a promoter called Colonel Tom Parker. In November of 1955, Elvis was named the most promising country and western artist in a disc jockey poll. That same week, Elvis chose Colonel Tom Parker as his manager. The title of Colonel was purely honorary. In point of fact, Parker was a smooth-talking Dutch exile. He was a master negotiator and manipulator who convinced Presley and his father that he was the best available manager to maximize the young singer's earning potential.
There are so many different opinions on him, okay? There was good and bad in the Colonel.
It's clear that Elvis and Colonel Tom Parker had a love-hate relationship. The Colonel clearly made Elvis a very rich person and was probably one of the best negotiators in show business.
Parker quickly proved his worth. He made Elvis a nationwide celebrity by carefully selecting television shows for Elvis to appear on. He also negotiated a deal whereby RCA Records purchased Presley's contract from Sun Records for $40,000. At the time, this seemed an astronomical sum of money. It was, in retrospect, the best deal any record company ever got.
What really started it was all the promotion that he was given when he went over to RCA. That opened the door for all the performers after him. Because I agree with what John Lennon said, before Elvis there was nothing.
Elvis first appeared on the Dorsey Brothers television show, and in April of 1956, Elvis swung his hips before a wide TV audience on the Milton Berle Show. Afterwards, Berle received over 700,000 complaint letters about Elvis's appearance on the broadcast. What Elvis's critics did not understand was that bad publicity was still free publicity, and this only increased Presley's record sales. By the end of 1956, Elvis had 10 top 10 hits. It had taken less than 2 years for Elvis to go from a $37 a week truck driver to a millionaire superstar. He purchased a large home in Memphis and moved in with his family. Elvis could now provide his parents the luxuries they could not afford during his childhood. The Presleys enjoyed luxuries like comfortable furniture, wall-to-wall carpeting, and a big console television set. The irony about the early career of Elvis Presley was that despite his image in the adult world as a rebel, he was, when not touring or recording, a homebody. He lived with his parents. He insisted that any girl he dated would have to meet his mother first for her approval. Elvis was also a deeply religious person and often prayed at night to his dead brother Jesse. The more successful Elvis became, the more pain and guilt he felt for his stillborn brother. He felt guilty that he might have killed his brother because he was bigger or had taken too much of their mother's nutrition. Indeed, the more successful Elvis became, the more guilty he felt.
It's now understood in the 21st century that people born with a stillborn twin often develop a complex, especially as an adult, that may not be rational, but that somehow you're responsible for the death of your sibling. And the more successful you become, the more guilty you become. And Elvis, growing up in such a poor family that had such meager possessions, family was that much more important.
In his off time, Elvis enjoyed his life at home with his family. Gladys, however, constantly worried about Elvis when he was on tour. Every night while on the road, Elvis was under strict orders to call his mother. Although Gladys was proud of her son, she also felt that show business was corrupting him. She worried that his wild and often out-of-control fans might hurt him. Early on, Elvis enjoyed the fact that his fans would gather around his home, so he opted not to put up a fence. the fans would visit the property constantly, searching for any souvenir of Elvis. Their neighbors in Memphis often complained about the constant noise and traffic caused by the fans who gathered at the Presley home. At one point, the neighbors all signed a petition to buy the Presleys' home to get them out of the neighborhood. This infuriated Elvis because his fans had made him a success, and snubbing them was out of the question.
In Elvis's early career, some of his fans became so fanatical that in one case at a hotel in New Orleans, 6 female fans overpowered a hotel elevator operator, tied him up, and held Elvis a prisoner in the elevator for over an hour until the police persuaded them to release him.
It was clear to Colonel Parker that Elvis's fans just couldn't get enough of him. He had big plans for the young star. Parker reasoned that the Sunday night television showdown between the Ed Sullivan Show and the Steve Allen Show would be a perfect opportunity for Elvis to get even more exposure, and for the Colonel to drive up the fees for Elvis's TV appearances. Allen needed the ratings, but also needed to avoid any controversy. Ed Sullivan, the king of Sunday night television, had pledged that he would never have Elvis on his show. In June of 1956, Elvis appeared on the Steve Allen Show. Allen had decided the best way to handle the Elvis controversy was to make fun of it. Elvis wore a tuxedo and sang Hound Dog to an actual basset hound.
Hello?
Did you have fun tonight on the Steve Allen Show?
Yes, sir, I really did. I really enjoyed it.
First time you ever worked in tux or tails?
It's the first time I ever had one on, period.
What do you keep in mind mostly? I mean, some of the songs you're going to do, or some of your plans, or what? What goes through your mind?
Well, everything has happened to me so fast in the last year and a half till I'm all mixed up, you know. I mean, I can't keep up with everything that's happening. And
They predict that Elvis Presley will be another James Dean. Now, have you heard that?
I've heard something about it, but I would never compare myself in any way to James Dean, because James Dean was a genius in acting.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'll say that I sure would like to. I mean, I guess there's a lot of actors in Hollywood that would like to have had the ability that James Dean had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I would never compare myself with James Dean in any way. You know?
Now, if you had your choice, would you prefer to be an actor than to be a singing entertainer?
If I were a good actor, although if I ever break into the acting completely, I'll still continue my singing. I'll still continue making records.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ed Sullivan now had no choice but to relent and put Elvis on his show. Colonel Parker negotiated a $50,000 fee for 3 appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. Elvis's first appearance in September 1956 garnered 54 million viewers and 82% of the audience. Up until that time, it was the single most watched program in television history.
I first saw him on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956. I don't know, that's the year I turned 6. And I've been a fan of his ever since. I've always wanted to be like him.
Ironically, Elvis's appearance reigned as the most watched television program in the annals of TV until the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan in February of 1964. In one Sullivan performance, Elvis was filmed from the waist up, but still gave the audience a teaser by swinging his arms wildly. The thing Elvis's critics didn't understand was that by not showing Elvis's swinging pelvis, it became forbidden fruit. This only made his young audience even more curious to see what they were missing.
These teenagers being born in very late 1940s and into the 50s and the early 60s, they were born at the same time as the birth of a new social phenomenon, and that, of course, is consumerism. That very important new introduction into American society is the difference between popular culture in terms of its impact and its power at that time, as opposed to, say, the World War II and Depression era generations. To me, that's the important difference. Jump cut from the Depression to 1955, 56, 57, and things are radically different. The idea of a depression is just not in the minds of this new generation of young people who will eventually become teenagers in the late 50s and throughout the 60s. The way this relates to Elvis is that being around at the same time as these people are, with the dilation of popular culture, the expansion of it, and consumer culture, someone like Elvis is able to reach more people. And you also have these new people called teenagers who are a bit more, like I said, more adventurous about what it is they can expect out of life.
In the summer of 1956, Elvis took the inevitable step and appeared in his first Hollywood film. It was a Civil War drama originally titled The Reno Brothers. However, the studio renamed it Love Me Tender to take advantage of Elvis's hit song of the same title. Colonel Parker had a long-term strategy that foresaw Elvis gaining a much wider audience by focusing on a movie career. This would get Elvis away from the controversial rock and roll concert circuit, which Parker saw as just a passing fad. Indeed, as a youngster while sitting in darkened movie theaters, Elvis had always dreamed of becoming a movie star, and as a teenager he idolized James Dean. In Love Me Tender, Elvis surprised many critics by displaying good dramatic acting skills that many felt would improve as his big-screen career progressed. The movie was a huge hit. Colonel Parker's strategy to give Elvis a more wholesome image through his movie roles was working. 1957 was a very successful year for Elvis. His next movie, Loving You, filmed in color, was another box office hit, and he continued to top the charts with his records. It was in 1957 that Elvis bought a much larger and more private home in Memphis called Graceland. Gladys and Vernon selected Graceland themselves. It was a beautiful mansion built in 1939, and it sat in the middle of 13 acres of land. It had limestone columns and a large fence around the entire estate.
As he got more well-known and had more money coming in, he went from better house to Graceland. And finally he gave his mother what he always wanted to give her. A nice big house. She didn't have to work anymore. People to take care of her, servants.
At the end of the main driveway, Elvis had iron gates installed, decorated with a guitar and musical notes. To Elvis, Graceland was symbolic of his success. In 1957, Elvis spent much of his time in Hollywood making films. The Colonel had a formula he wanted Elvis to follow. Elvis would make a film, and with it, a soundtrack album. The Colonel reasoned that this would be the best way to maximize Elvis's earning potential. In the summer of 1957, Elvis made Jailhouse Rock.
Elvis acts in Jailhouse Rock. His first dramatic singing role. Plays sort of a blackboard jungle type of kid, you know, and he's terrific. Elvis sings, Elvis fights, Elvis dances, and Elvis falls in love. This picture, Jailhouse Rock's a terrific picture for teenagers, and is wonderful too. I've seen it, and I enjoyed every minute.
Don't miss Elvis Presley, Judy Tyler, and Mickey Shaughnessy in MGM's Jailhouse Rock in CinemaScope.
The famous Jailhouse Rock number was one that Elvis choreographed himself. He also was instrumental in designing the costumes for the scene. Once again, the film was a huge box office hit, and like his previous films, Love Me Tender and Loving You, Elvis exhibited great potential as a dramatic actor. Meanwhile, Elvis's continuing impact on the music world allowed performers like Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis to become huge commercial successes. All were artists on the Sun record label, where Elvis himself had started out. On the surface, Elvis Presley appeared to be the happiest man alive. But the burden of being the biggest star in the world was getting to him. He once told a friend, "I have thousands of fans out there, and I have a lot of people who call themselves my friends, but I feel real lonely sometimes." The pressures of Hollywood and the gossip reporters were taking their toll on Presley. Elvis's private misery, however, was not evident in his increasing success. In late 1957, Elvis made King Creole and once again gave a solid performance in a film many consider his best work.
I would say his first 4 movies were the best movies he's ever done. Definitely. Absolutely, especially in King Creole.
It seemed that nothing could stop Elvis Presley's career. Nothing except for the draft.
1956, Elvis Presley revolutionizes rock and roll. It looked like nothing could slow him down. But something did. Drafted at the peak of his success, Presley is inducted into the Army on March 24th, 1958. He does his basic training at Fort Hood in Texas. Later, he serves the 3rd Armored Division in Germany as a truck driver. While in the Army in 1958, Elvis Presley will earn nearly $2 million. Otherwise, he will be just like any other soldier. Almost.
In 1958, Elvis was drafted. The shrewd Colonel Parker had Elvis record dozens of songs. The records could be released during his military service. Colonel Parker arranged for a major media send-off. Even Elvis's detractors admired the fact that he made no attempt to get out of military service. Parker stage managed the media coverage to hype Elvis as a patriotic American boy doing his duty. On March 24, 1958, Elvis answered the call to serve when he appeared for basic training. His mother was dressed in black, her eyes puffy from crying. Elvis did his basic training in Arkansas and was then stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. Gladys Presley, the ever overprotective mother, feared that Elvis would never survive military service. Sadly, it was Gladys herself who would not survive. Gladys Presley was not a well woman. The constant stress of worrying about her son took its toll. She was overweight and drank more than she should have. In August of 1958, Gladys Presley died of heart failure. She was 42 years old. Elvis was absolutely devastated by his mother's death. His grief bordered on devastation. He seemed to lose his moral compass.
After his mom died, he had more commitments that he had to fulfill, but he didn't want to be Elvis anymore. He felt like life was nothing without his mother. He just didn't want to be Elvis anymore after his mom died.
In a strange way, however, Elvis was also liberated by his mother's passing. Her doting fearfulness was no longer a constant hindrance to Elvis.
When his mother died in 1958, the one person who probably could have kept him in line was gone. She basically kept a leash on his getting spoiled by success. And when she tragically died in 1958, as much as it was emotionally devastating to Elvis, it was almost like he was also unleashed, that he could spend money any way he wanted, which he did. And his father, after he remarried in 1960, Elvis strongly resented and felt betrayed.
Clearly, there would be no more restraints on his life once he got out of the military, and he would never again feel guilty for spending his money wildly. When Elvis reported for duty after his mother's funeral, he was sent to West Germany, where he rented a home near the base for his father and grandmother. He excelled in tank training and was routinely promoted to Specialist 4th Class. He did nighttime tank patrols and even camped overnight in sub-freezing temperatures. To make sure that Elvis's image of an American boy doing his duty stayed intact, Colonel Parker pulled some strings to keep Elvis out of the special services, where his singing talent may have gotten him out of active duty. Elvis was not even permitted to perform for free or even sing at a talent show on the troop ship carrying him overseas. In addition, Parker planned to release some of the songs Elvis had recorded before being drafted, This way he would still remain on the charts and in the public eye. In the service, Elvis spent his days as an ordinary soldier, but at night he returned to his little Memphis family on the Rhine. Elvis did sing in private, especially at numerous parties at his home. At one of these parties, he met the 14-year-old stepdaughter of an officer at the base. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu. She was sweet and fragile. They quickly developed a close relationship. In private, Priscilla found Elvis to be very insecure. An unfortunate element of Elvis's military duty was his introduction to drugs.
When Elvis was in the Army, he was turned on to amphetamines by his superiors, who thought it was a safe way to allow people to stay up. And even when Elvis got out of the Army, he often was dependent on amphetamines to be able to get up early for these Hollywood movie calls, and also take downers to be able to get to sleep. And it created a cycle that just got worse and worse as time went on.
Speed banished Elvis's periodic depression and gave him the endurance to do nighttime patrols and other duties. Elvis felt the pills were harmless because they were legal. Ironically, Elvis had been demonized during his early success as a rebel and a bad influence on American youth. He was, however, at the time, very innocent and naive. Then, when he went into the military, many felt he had become an honorable citizen by serving his country. Yet it was in the Army that the demons that would haunt him for the rest of his life came to the surface.
Elvis, do you think the music has changed since you've been out of the service? I mean, since you've been in the service?
Possibly, yes. I can't say, really. I haven't been here long enough to even know. Excuse me. The only thing I can say is that if it has changed, well, I would be foolish not to try to change with it, you know. But as of now, I have no reason to change anything.
As to your acting, you have stated you would like to be a more serious actor. And do you plan to possibly go to some school or some dramatic school?
Well, it wouldn't hurt me any to go to school, but I learn best by experience. I never was very good in schools of any kind. And it's going to take me a long time and a lot of experience.
But that is your ultimate ambition?
But at the present time, it really is.
After being discharged from military service, Elvis was concerned that his hiatus from public attention may have dampened the interest of his fans. Colonel Parker, however, had kept the publicity machine going. Later in 1960, Elvis made his only television appearance between 1957 and 1968. Frank Sinatra, the nation's other reigning show business icon, wanted Elvis to make his return from the Army on the Frank Sinatra television show. After long negotiations with the Colonel, Sinatra, as usual, got what he wanted. At first, Elvis feared Sinatra would try to make fun of him like Steve Allen had done in 1956. The chairman of the board, however, showed Elvis great respect. Their appearance together is one of the seminal moments in American entertainment history. At the time, no one realized that in seeing Frank and Elvis together, they were witnessing the pairing of the two most influential American entertainers of the 20th century, and perhaps of all time.
Guitar starts strumming. Hey, Frank! Look and see who's coming. Where? His smiles that glitter like crows. Where? What happened? I think it's over here.
But it's so nice. He's here in person.
I may pass out.
You won't like it. Where the heck are his sideburns? Germany.
Well, I'll be a hound dog.
And that's the opening, friends.
Something was great. It was great, and I'm glad to see the Army hasn't changed it. Wasn't it great?
That's the first time I ever heard a woman screaming at a male singer. Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't you remember me there, Charlie?
Excuse me, sir, Mr. Presley, but would you think it presumptuous of Frank if he joined you in a duet?
Well, yeah, that would be great.
I would consider it quite an honor. I'll tell you. I'd like to do one of your songs.
All right.
I mean, you know, with you.
Fine, fine. You know, I was wondering, as a matter of fact, while you were singing Elvis, I thought to myself, I wonder what would have happened if I had recorded Love Me Tender instead of you. I wouldn't have made any difference.
I think it would about 2 million records less. He said that.
You smarty pants.
For my darling, I love you.
It's pretty all the time, Frank.
Sure does, buddy.
And I always will.
Nancy, you've met Mr. Presley, haven't you?
Of course. How are you, Mr. Presley?
You can call me Elvis.
Oh,
You
thank
call him Mr. Presley, cause on account of she's been spoken for.
That's the way the cookie crumbles.
That's the way the cookie crumbles.
Despite the differences in their ages and styles, the chairman of the board and the king had much in common. In doing the Sinatra show and seeing the reaction of the fans, Elvis realized that despite his fears, his career was intact. During most of the 1960s, the Colonel followed the strategy he had planned for Elvis before the Army. Elvis made movies accompanied by soundtrack albums. He made no concert appearances and did no recordings save for the songs on his movie soundtracks. This strategy paid off in earnings for Elvis, as his movies continued to rake it in at the box office and the songs still topped the pop charts. But this was also a time of unrealized potential for Elvis. The movies, by anyone's reckoning, were uninspired formula pictures, and the songs were certainly not among the King's best work. Yet in each film and with each song, Elvis did his absolute best to give his fans what they wanted. There were flashes of acting brilliance in the movies and moments of that old rock and roll fire in the songs. But these moments, more than anything, just illustrated how great Elvis could have been had he been given better material to work with.
His pre-Army movies were really stories written around his musical career. After he came out of the Army, they were formulaic. I think that they kind of just used Elvis as an entity to push forward his film career. He really wanted to be a serious actor, and the films that they kept on making with Hal Wallace were just, schlock films. Their songs really weren't great in the films, and Elvis was just doing these characters. The Colonel really sold out Elvis after he got back from the Army. He just used him again as an entity.
Elvis now had the money and power to live out the fantasies denied him as a teenager. Above all else, Elvis was a generous man and loved to give lavish gifts to friends and strangers alike. He bought fancy cars that he rarely drove. Elvis Presley had it all, and there was still an emptiness in his life. Despite all his success and all his money, Elvis Presley was not an entirely happy man. Then came Priscilla, the young girl he had met in Germany. She was constantly on his mind. Although she was only 16 at the time, Elvis managed to convince her parents to let her come to America and live at Graceland while she finished high school. The public and gossip columnists knew nothing of their relationship. Elvis was careful not to cross any moral lines with the underage Priscilla. He often left her behind in Memphis while he spent most of his time in Hollywood making movies. As much as Elvis feared sleeping in the dark, he also feared sleeping alone. But there were more than enough volunteers to share his bed with him while in Hollywood. He had frequent flings with his leading ladies or the many actress wannabes who sought him out. Priscilla was quite frustrated at reading about his other romances, especially a well-publicized one with Anne Margaret. Priscilla loved Elvis enough, however, to overlook everything. When she turned 21, she and Elvis would be married. After a long courtship, the marriage took place in Las Vegas in May of 1967.
Elvis was never the same after his mom passed away. And I think he found in Priscilla a lot of his mom in her. And I think that's why he got as close to her as he did.
In some ways, Elvis was grooming her to become the future wife of Elvis Presley. And to be fair, Elvis apparently didn't have any physical romance with her until she turned 21 and they got married.
By 1964, Elvis's reign as the king of rock and roll was threatened with the British invasion and the Motown groups. Again, there was great irony in this situation. All the British bands had been profoundly influenced by Elvis and idolized him. At this time, Elvis was not happy with the direction of his career. The social and cultural atmosphere in the nation also perplexed him. He had mixed feelings about the Vietnam War. He saw himself as a soldier who had put his career on hold to do his duty. Indeed, the youth culture that exploded in the 1960s was one that Elvis had been a catalyst for. Still, it turned out to be a movement he didn't quite understand. And unlike stars today, Elvis preferred to keep his political views to himself. Elvis also developed serious doubts about his Hollywood career with his longtime film producer Hal Wallace. It was a situation filled with irony. Wallace was using profits from the Elvis movies to produce the kind of serious films Elvis wanted to be in, but Wallace felt that Presley wasn't a good enough actor to appear in these films. Despite the lightweight plots of his movies, the Elvis magic endured from film to film. These movies depended mostly on Elvis's charisma to attract his fans, and there was no need for great acting, strong plot lines, or even good music. No matter how silly the plot or the costumes, his fans didn't seem to care. Elvis felt trapped. Colonel Parker insisted that Elvis continue making these types of films. Quite often, Elvis thought of his business relationship with Parker as a kind of affluent servitude. His control over Elvis and his career made Parker seem like one of the sharecropping bosses that had dominated the lives of his parents back in Mississippi. Elvis's father, Vernon, also put pressure on Elvis to stick to Parker's career decisions. Vernon paid the bills at Graceland and realized that if the money didn't keep flowing, Elvis could be in serious trouble. At this time, Elvis's dependence on prescription drugs increased dramatically. He used uppers to stay awake and downers to get some sleep. It became a vicious cycle.
Look, there was a whole corporation that needed to be kept alive and going and moving. And if Elvis stopped, there's a lot of people out there who lose a lot of money.
By the late 1960s, Elvis's movies and music had waned in popularity. But this was tempered by the fact that on February 1st, 1968, Priscilla gave birth to Elvis's only child, Lisa Marie. Elvis's mental state seemed to improve with the birth of his beloved daughter. Later in 1968, with his movie career and record sales slipping badly, Elvis felt it was time for a change. Many fans had been writing to him begging Elvis to do live performances once again. Colonel Parker even encouraged Elvis to start touring. Elvis felt it was time to make a comeback. He decided he would perform on television for the first time in 8 years. The special was scheduled for December of 1968. Colonel Parker wanted a tame Christmas special with songs like The Little Drummer Boy. Fortunately for Elvis and his fans, NBC assigned an assertive young producer named Steve Binder to do the television concert. Binder had a vision of resurrecting the lost Elvis, the original rebel rocker. Elvis hadn't been so energized or inspired by a project in many years.
The motivating force behind that, I think, was his new marriage to Priscilla and his new baby, Lisa Marie. I think that's what bolstered him, on top of the British invasion.
He had stopped taking pills, lost weight, and gotten himself back into shape for the taping. Privately, he was terrified of failing his fans after such a long hiatus from live performances, but was energized by resurrecting himself as a musical artist and not an artificial B-grade movie star. He didn't disappoint his fans. The Elvis comeback special was a huge success. His fans welcomed him back like an old friend. It was magic. Magic that only Elvis Presley was capable of. It was near the end of 1968. The nation was divided by the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. There were riots in the streets. And yet, for a shining moment, Elvis Presley took center stage and rocked America as only he could. In 1969, Elvis signed a contract to appear for a 4-week stint in Las Vegas and would soon go on to become one of the Strip's biggest all-time headliners. His first appearance in Las Vegas back in the late 50s had not gone well. Elvis just wasn't mature enough as a performer, and the audiences back then still viewed him as some kind of oddity. By the late 60s, however, Elvis was an American icon.
Elvis in Vegas in the 1950s was a completely different Elvis in Vegas in the late 1960s. In the 1950s, Elvis, his audience was teenage girls, so he was singing, Hound Dog, and he was singing all his popular hits from them. But the audiences that were going to a Vegas hotel were not teenage girls. They were all adults. In the 1960s, when he kind of changed his musical career, he became more of an entertainer rather than a pop star. And he just repackaged himself.
Even though Vegas was as glitzy and phony as Hollywood, Elvis enjoyed performing before live audiences. His first performance in July 1969 electrified the audience. He broke all attendance records. He proved himself the master showman. Las Vegas would become a regular stop on Elvis's concert tours. Between 1968 and 1973, Elvis gave hundreds of live performances throughout the nation. He poured more energy into his stage act than many thought possible. Sadly, during this time, Elvis became more and more dependent on prescription drugs. Being a star of his magnitude, Elvis had little trouble getting the prescriptions he wanted from various doctors. In 1973, Elvis did the Aloha from Hawaii concert that was televised live by satellite to over 1.5 billion viewers worldwide. He worked out extensively to get into good physical shape. The Elvis comeback had reached its height. Unfortunately, Elvis's frequent traveling and his romantic affairs while on the road had irrevocably damaged his marriage to Priscilla. Yet his own behavior had caused it. He was even more devastated when he and Priscilla were eventually divorced.
After Priscilla left him, he just didn't want to be Elvis anymore. He just didn't want to. Again, things started to go downhill for Elvis, and I don't know if he was consciously trying to kill himself or what, but after Priscilla left him, I noticed that he was going downhill.
After his split with Priscilla, Elvis turned to prescription drugs even more than before. It is and will always be pure speculation why Elvis did this. Perhaps much of it had to do with just having to be Elvis Presley. No other performer in the history of entertainment could possibly ever understand or even comprehend the pressures he felt. Perhaps it was the relentlessness of his hectic schedule. With one concert after another, traveling from one end of the country to the other. Perhaps it was the emotional pain of losing his wife and family. And then, there was always pressure from Colonel Parker to keep going, to keep the money flowing. Or maybe it was just a combination of all these things. We'll never know. His live performances began to suffer, and he put on a tremendous amount of weight. But the fans didn't seem to care. They wanted Elvis any way they could get him. On August 15, 1977, Elvis didn't eat anything all day because he was dieting for his upcoming concert tour. He was still taking too many pills. He apparently didn't sleep that night either. He told his girlfriend, Ginger Alden, that he was going into the bathroom to read. The next day, August 16, 1977, Elvis was found dead in the bathroom of his Graceland bedroom. He was 42 years old. Cardiac arrest was listed as the cause of his death. Millions around the world will always remember where they were when the news of Elvis's death reached them. All three network news shows led that night with the story of the death of Elvis Presley. It is virtually impossible to describe in words the impact his passing had around the world. Elvis left behind a young daughter, an ex-wife who still loved him, a grief-stricken father who would follow him in death just 2 years later, and millions of heartbroken fans around the world.
I feel a loss because Elvis is not here anymore. I can't explain it. I just feel a personal loss. He was such an influence on me in my life.
Since his death, there has been much speculation about his drug use, his lifestyle, his bad eating habits, and so much more. In the end, however, a man's life should be judged not by what he accomplished for himself in his lifetime, but how he touched the lives of other people. Elvis Presley continues to touch the lives of millions and millions of people around the world. The legacy Elvis left behind was that of a rock and roll icon, the biggest and brightest star the music world has ever known. His life illustrated the American dream come true, but also illustrated a sobering reality about the heavy price of fame. In his 42 years of life, Elvis had changed a great deal from the down-home, shy country boy who walked into the Sun recording studio in 1954. But America had also changed a great deal because of him. And yet, for as much as he had changed, at his core and in his heart, Elvis was always that polite, generous, warm-hearted, insecure country boy who wanted to sing a song. We will never know, indeed no one can ever know, what drove Elvis to do the things he did. For all the rumors, speculation, and negativity that has surfaced since his death, the fact is, on balance, the positive things Elvis contributed far outweigh the negative. There is certainly a tragic irony in the way he died and the fact he was so young when he left us. And there is always an overwhelming sadness in knowing that his death would not have occurred had Elvis taken better care of himself and not become involved with drugs. And all this leaves us with the lingering question of what might have been had he lived.
In addition to being profoundly talented, he was an icon way early, in his in a part of his career where he began to reach mass audiences. He is a towering achiever as an artist. He is one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Elvis Presley has gone through certain changes that have not really besmirched his icon status. When he has gone from this youthful teen idol of sexuality and racial transgression articulated in his singing style and in his his choice of source music, all the way through into the late 60s and early 70s, when his music actually began to take on a rather stronger social conscience. He began to sing songs about life in the ghetto. And I mean, it's really interesting, the songs that he started singing about back in those days. And yet, with all these transformations, he's still the king of rock and roll.
The first generation Elvis fans introduced their children to Elvis and to their children's children. Being down in Memphis the last couple of years, the fan base has been getting younger and younger. There are more people in the shops, younger people in the shops, buying his music and his movies. Elvis will always be number one. He'll always be the king of rock and roll.
What we do have left is the music. Indeed, even toward the end of his life, when Elvis was not at his best, there were still those moments on stage that were pure magic. A magic only Elvis could create. When it was just Elvis, the music, and his fans. This, above all else, was what Elvis Presley was all about. We had never seen his like before, and most certainly will never see his like again. He was, and will always remain, the King.
For my darling, I love you.
Man, that's pretty.